Good afternoon, everybody. You've got a bit of a double act today of me and Ben. So I'm David Vallely. I currently head up the Strategic Customer Management team at HMRC, heading up the traders and intermediaries bit, and my colleague Ben, again, still working in the Stakeholder Engagement team. So I've probably talked...
If you just push the green button.
So I've probably talked to a number of you at different times over the last 3 years, so it's nice to finally be here in person. I think I missed the one last year, probably on holiday or something else like that. Got to be cheeky at this time of year. So as Des said, we're going to kind of touch on a little bit of kind of where we've come from and what's coming over the hill. So a little bit of what Sue's already touched on, of course. CDS is the big show in town at the moment. So this is a slide you've probably all seen a fair bit in the past over the last 2 years, especially if you've been on any of the other ACITA events or HMRC events that I've been presenting on. But I think it is worth having a bit of a pause to reflect on how much change the industry's gone through in the last 2 years. So the staged customs controls that ended at the beginning of this year and 2021 of those delayed declarations and the process we went through of all of that and that perpetual change that we were going through that last 2 years, again in the wider scheme of COVID and the challenges that presented as well. Transit was always a challenge from the word go, something that we weren't able to come to in stages. That was pre-existing agreement that we had to jump straight into wholeheartedly. And then the export element that did change earlier than most other bits. And reflecting a little bit more on this year, I think we all know January was a big challenge. It didn't go perfectly. I think we can all openly admit to that. But the resounding feedback we seem to have got from industry is it could have gone worse, which, when it comes to changes like this, is almost a resounding success at times. So I partly want to just thank everybody for your continued engagement with all of this, and it obviously doesn't stop here, and there are a lot more changes coming up, let alone CDS. There are other bits happening as well. So I shall pass over to my colleague Ben, who will run through those, and we'll try and make a bit of time on the agenda as well.
So what we thought we'd do next, so we're running a timeline of what's happened and what's going to happen, and the slides, as we've said to Des and others, can be shared afterwards, so there's no worries about taking any sort of trying to capture big walls of text. So effectively, as David's touched upon, 1st of January this year, end of stage customs controls. A lot of the processes have come in. I won't dally on that at all. However, what I would like to highlight is, as many of you will be aware, there was a call for evidence which was opened in February, and there we were reaching out to stakeholders and asking them what they wanted effectively in terms of things like simplified customs declaration processes, transit facilitation, what the role of the customs intermediary sector was. I know that's something that's of great interest to a number of people, specifically yourselves obviously for that role, but also in businesses wanting to know the relationship they need to have, could have, should have with intermediaries. And separately, and this is a theme that I think is a big part of the forward look, what the UK could do in terms of establishing a single trade window. So that all took place in February. That was an opportunity for people to provide some very early thoughts in and part of shaping policy going forwards. Then, as you'll all know, the end of April of this year, there was a bit of a change in timings. I will say, I'm sure others will smirk at that comment, but there was a change in timings, and the Minister for Brexit Opportunities, Jacob Rees-Mogg, announced that the changes that were planned for the 1st of July of this year would not be introduced this year, and they would be pushed further out into the future, and that we would take stock of where we were and what we wanted to do at that point with an idea towards shaping the future. And the way we're going to do that is we're publishing a target operating model in the autumn, and then looking at the end of 2023 for the introduction of the remaining customs controls, and looking at doing so in a more sort of complete way. So we say target operating model. That sounds very exciting. What does it actually mean when we're not talking about it as government? Well, it's a number of things working together. And I think from a stakeholder engagement perspective, one of the things we're trying to do a lot more efficiently this time, many of you have all dealt with government in its many forms and many agencies and so forth, and its many different policy drives. What we're trying to do here is take a one government co-design approach to delivering change at the border. So there are a number of different work streams, as you can see up here. The SPS model sits with DEFRA. I don't know if, I can't remember from the agenda if you've had anyone from DEFRA speak to you today, but not today, no. You definitely did last time around, didn't you? The safety and security model is something that we're currently working through at the moment. And then there's the very grandly named ecosystem of trust and pilots on businesses working together with intermediaries and carriers and logistics companies and so forth to look at how trust functions on an end-to-end supply chain plus logistics element, which includes developing trusted trade regimes as appropriate and ensuring that what we have offers something of benefit to people who want to use it, as well as obviously providing benefit to HMG in terms of being able to trust people. Again, single trade window is likely to be a large part of the way of delivering that, but also mapping out the benefits themselves and so forth. I've put a link on there on the basis that the slides will be shared to enable people to click through and fill out the Cabinet Office survey. You've got 2 weeks to do so, but obviously I'm sure ACITA will look at doing so as a whole, but obviously individuals will have potentially different opinions and may wish to do so themselves. So just a bit more detail about safety and security. That's the area that HMRC is most closely involved with, and that is effectively a sort of a fundamental examination of the way that the system works, looking at sort of first principles about data. Where does data become available? Who owns it? How do they trust the person who gave it to them? At what point is it provided? So, for example, at the moment, the active mode of transport is responsible for providing that information, but if they're the ferry company, for example, have obtained that from the logistics company who's obtained it from the person who has provided the goods at the point of loading. Is that the most efficient way? And so the approach there is very much to reduce costs, reduce friction, but at the same time keeping a mind on enhancing security at the border. So again, we have a number of different elements within that work. We're looking at the data requirements, we're looking at data collection, we're looking at the role of technology, things like single trade window, things like pre-lodgement of declarations under GVMS and systems like that. How does that all interplay together to create a single safe approach to managing safety and security at the border? And again, that's also linking back somewhat to what we're calling the ecosystem of trust, which is the trusted trader schemes going forwards, what they look like, what role they play in terms of people. And spoken to many of you over the last 2 weeks in terms of we conducted a number of roundtables, we invited members of the J3C, and we also we took people who wanted to take part in that discussion. That is an ongoing discussion through October, November sort of time, and then into next year to look into delivery as well. So it's very much a case of co-design. It's very much a case of working with industry rather than sort of going away into a silo and then hiding for 3 months and then coming back and saying, ta-da, we've done this. We're very much engaging people throughout that process in terms of sketching things. One thing we did want to sort of very briefly mention, this seems to have passed a few people by, but in terms of safety and security facilitations, we've announced 4 elements which would not apply from the 1st of January, 1st of July, some facilitations there. So I'll leave you to read them all rather than sort of read them out verbatim, not least because my eyes are a bit squinty and I can't quite see the slide, and it's incredibly small on my display down here, so I won't read it out. The one I would highlight is the interport transshipments. That's what everyone calls flight trucks, but flight trucks themselves not being a formal term, but nonetheless that's happened. CDS migration, you've had people speak to you about that already, so I'll skip past those 2. And then you did have a panel selection here, but I think we're already 25 minutes over. So, Des, I'll leave it to you. What sort of questions you want to handle?
If I could just ask one question to you guys. I mean, there's a sort of constant talk about engagement, and a lot of our members have come back to us and said everything's sort of closed. You try and sort of chat to get involved in the single sort of trade window discussions. It's not possible. Is there a way in? If you're not part of a consortium, you seem to be completely ignored.
So I would say there's two responses to that. First off is we have been running some roundtables. We invited people to self-nominate for those, and we've had a variety of people from trade bodies and from individual businesses as well, self-representing on those. And the second is through data gathering, through, for example, the survey that's on there. That's a Cabinet Office survey. It's directed into the team that is coordinating the target operating model across the whole of Whitehall. It's an opportunity for people to contribute their own perspectives. A lot of the information we're looking at is, how do you get information? How do you know who you're going to give that information to? What's the earliest point it's available, etc. That's very different for different businesses and depending on their ownership of their own logistics chain, of their own supply chain, where they're bringing things in or whether they're buying things manufactured in the UK. These all have different impacts, so we're keen to hear from everybody. So there is that survey link is a Google Forms document that provides the opportunity for future contact as well. But there are routes in, and there's customers routes through our external stakeholders mailbox, gets you directly into the sort of the core team there, that then does a sort of triage process and gets that to the relevant teams. Plus the call for evidence was an opportunity to contribute directly.
I think the worry is when we're going to get back on that call for evidence, there seems to be sort of a couple of players out there in the marketplace that say they are sort of already the sort of elected sort of the software supplier or consultancy experts that have already been sort of chosen by the government agencies. I understand there's only sort of a pilot coming in.
So we mentioned the ecosystem of trust. I think that's probably what they're referring to, and that's a Cabinet Office, Home Office sort of initiative. They're looking at building groups that were able to test things that they had in mind.
Yeah, and
so
this is very much where I believe it is, but the message seems to be sort of skewed. We've actually spoken to a couple of members, and so we are convinced that no one's actually been sort of appointed to as a preferred supplier in the building.
Arnie and I had this conversation at a similar event a couple of weeks ago, and I think people overestimate the stage that government is in the process. Is what I would say. So the call for evidence was in February. The call for evidence was asking some very high-level questions around things like, what are the benefits to a UK trader of being within a trusted trader scheme? What do you actually get out of it? And what do you have to give back in exchange for getting that? And is that balance, in your perspective, fair? What data do we gather? Who has that data? Where is that data? When does it apply? And people will talk about, for example, pre-lodgement of declarations. Could that provide a route in? Well, is that necessarily applicable to all routes? And one of the questions, we had some roundtables that were open to all. I think they were advertised through the J3C desk, so I'm sure you will have seen the invite. And we were very much sort of asking first principles questions. What is the right way? What does multi-filing look like? What does it look like if people are able to own the data themselves at different points in that chain and pass that ownership on and so forth? There's no appointed suppliers for anything at the moment. We are still in the design phase, and obviously I can't speak for where we will end up as government in the future, but certainly from a design phase, there's no expectation that necessarily anyone will be forced along a singular route. One of the questions we're asking is there a benefit to having an opportunity for traders to directly enter the information, and what sort of functionality would that need to have versus what is the opportunities for functionality that people could deliver that would enable a better service if you wanted to pay more or pay less or whatever else, and you pick your model that fits you. If you're somebody exporting 300 times a year, you want a very different service to somebody who's exporting 300 times a day. Yeah. Sorry, that's a very long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah, but thank you. I think we're completely on the same page. I'm supposed to hold this so that's not recorded.
Extremely loud.
Are there any questions for the panelists? We can have one or two questions before we go to lunch. Does anyone have any questions for Anani, for Sue, for these guys that they'd like to ask at the moment?
Benefit of being directly before lunch.
I have to bring a microphone, otherwise we can't hear questions.
I have been told I've got a very loud voice, so I wouldn't really worry too much. Especially on the golf course, I've had quite a bit of criticism in the past. Anyway, just tying a few things together. The CDS mail out or sending out information about the changes went to about 220,000 people. companies. There's a heck of a lot of companies that are doing importing and exporting in the UK. Are you seriously, and yet many of them you'll be wanting to obtain the trusted trader status. How's all of this going to happen before the end of next year, when Mr. Rees-Mogg was wanting some of this all to be in place?
I suppose the only answer I can really give to that one is at the moment the question is, what does that trusted trader scheme look like? And I suppose depending on the level at which you pitch that trusted trader scheme depends on the level of compliance and so forth. I'm aware obviously AEOS, for example, at the moment is an extremely in-depth process, 3 years of customs management knowledge at least for at least one person involved within the system. Coming around and auditing the locks on the door, I think, is something I heard someone say the other day, and checking the parking lot is secure, etc. There's a difference between different levels of trust, and the ecosystem of trust work is to look at what trust is the baseline trust, what trust is earned and how is it earned, and so forth. And that opens you up to all sorts of routes to consider. Do you trust somebody until you know that you can't trust them, and vice versa. So I suppose that's probably the best answer I can give you at this stage. In terms of the forward look, obviously if there is a move towards a different scheme, then as you rightly observed, there's an onboarding process for any of those things, and is it feasible to test and fully assess 220,000 people, obviously, and I think you've come to your own conclusions on what the answer to that one is. I won't give a government perspective on it, but certainly there's scope there, and I think it's the AEO equivalent scheme that the US operates. I think they do comply and explain, and they do testing post fact and monitoring and so forth. So I mean, there are options that are out there that are existent in the way that things work in other territories. And one of the questions we're asking is, from your experience of other territories, when is that a good thing? When is that a bad thing? And obviously there's two elements, I suppose, to it. From a personal perspective, one is, are you gaining trust correctly, and are you losing out to someone else having trust that they should not have? And I suppose they're the two key interests for businesses, is am I getting something that that is costing me a lot of money to obtain when somebody else is obtaining the same benefits for free, or has obtained them and should not have been granted them. And so there's a whole host of processes I'll be going through in the ecosystem of trust work to ensure that the scheme operates correctly, and as many people have said to us, operates the benefits it wants, equivalent to the burden it imposes.
Thank you. Quick question before lunch.
Thanks. Sorry, Ben Price from Halfords. I was sitting here feeling very old watching the presentation on the single window earlier, because nearly 15 years to the day I started in government, and I was working on the international trade single window, was one of my first jobs in government. How confident are we of actually achieving a single window solution this time round? Because I mean, we have been trying to get to that for a number of years, and does CDS really, I suppose, help to facilitate that outcome? And have we picked up the work that was done sort of 10, 15 years ago, or are we starting everything from scratch?
And shouldn't we direct that to Raki and to Arne as well? I mean, what are your guys' opinions? I mean, is it something that you guys believe are achievable in terms of single trade window? Who's first?
Well, it must happen. Single trade window must happen, quite frankly. The EU is already thinking about how it works in their system. The world does it, as we've heard in the first presentation. So we must have it, and we must have it quick. But the key thing is the integration of all these initiatives and the free thinking. And what I mean is, where we don't want to end up is at the glorified way of what the EU has already told us and what the AEO scheme is. Because that's not forward thinking. Now we need to bring what the first session showed, modern technology, trusted trader experience around the world, different approaches from AEO, not only US, but also Jordan, Gordon staircase and whatnot, and all of these together and say, for the future, what is the right model for the UK? And that means a radical approach to trusted trader. And when you actually trust us, you trust us for real. And then we don't need all of these declarations. And that's more important in the SPS space than it is in the safety and security space, because this is where all the paperwork is. So we need to have this discussion about what is a trusted trader for SNS, but even more importantly, I think, what's a trusted trader for the SPS space? Because this is where the real benefits for trade are.
I don't think we've got a choice. If we want to be competing with the world stage or on the world stage, we don't have a choice. Every other country is doing it. We've got the technology to do that. I get that they are probably starting from scratch. And we have got integration, but at the same time, we've got experience. And now being an independent country, I think we have to do that. Otherwise, the trade deals will become quite difficult. Ecosystem of trust, for example, every journey will be very different with different countries. The SPS goods that you mentioned is huge amount of paperwork. Safety is absolutely required. It is, going back to my presentation, it is not about efficient trade. It is ensuring that the supply chain is there and the economy is running. We do not want another toilet roll crisis, do we now? So this has to happen, and government will have to do whatever it needs to do to make sure that it does happen. As I said, there are 5 products that are already, you can kind of lift and shift onto any government. There is, of course, integration, but going back to your point, why do we need a declaration? In this day and age, when we've got meta world coming to us, why do we need a declaration? It is definitely going to enable us, declaration, safety and security, the DEFRA checks, licensing is going to enable us, because integration will be the key challenge, but it has to be done because as a trade, we're integrated, so it's time that government is integrated across the border agency.
Thank you very much. And I think we have now sort of run out of time completely. So thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers. Hope you're all here after lunch so we can... Thank you.